Welcome to our segment called Your Grandkids Are Paying For It, where we discuss the future expenses your descendants will cover. Dr. Grouch spills the beans on the Fed's 3,100% inflation party.
Dr. Grouch, can you start by explaining when the federal income tax became law and its initial details?
The federal income tax was made law in 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment in February. This allowed Congress to levy taxes on incomes without apportioning them among the states. It started as a progressive system with rates from 1% to 7% on high earners, targeting incomes over $3,000 for singles, which was quite high at the time.
What about the Federal Reserve's creation that same year? When was it established, and what was the accumulated inflation at that point?
The Federal Reserve was created on December 23, 1913, through the Federal Reserve Act, aimed at stabilizing banking and providing an elastic currency. At that immediate point, accumulated inflation since its creation was effectively 0%, as it was within the same year and tied initially to gold reserves.
What's the current accumulated inflation since the Fed's creation as of 2025?
The current accumulated inflation since 1913 is approximately 3,191%, based on CPI changes from about 9.8 in 1913 to 322.6 in 2025. This massive figure highlights how the dollar has been devalued over time through monetary expansion.
How much purchasing power has the U.S. dollar lost since 1913?
The dollar has lost over 97% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1913 now requires about $32 today due to this cumulative inflation. This erosion acts like a hidden tax on savings and wages.
Can you compare average annual inflation rates before and after the Federal Reserve's creation?
Before 1913, under the gold standard, average annual inflation was around 0.4%, with frequent periods of deflation. Since then, it's averaged about 3.1%, marking a shift to a more inflationary fiat money system.
What was the top federal income tax rate in 1913 compared to today?
It began at 7% on incomes over $500,000, which adjusts to about $15 million today. Now, the top rate is 37% on much lower inflation-adjusted income thresholds, showing how the tax base has expanded alongside inflation.
How has the U.S. national debt changed since the Federal Reserve was created?
In 1913, the national debt was about $3 billion, roughly 1% of GDP. Today, it's over $35 trillion, exceeding 100% of GDP, largely fueled by inflationary monetary policies and deficit financing.
If the lawmakers and voting bloc from 1913 were told that inflation would reach over 3,100% and be considered normal, what would they say?
Proponents like President Woodrow Wilson might express disbelief or regret, arguing the Fed was meant to stabilize with gold ties, not enable such devaluation. Opponents, such as Senator Elihu Root or Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., would likely call it a betrayal, validating their warnings about a money trust enriching elites through currency debasement.
What's the estimated percentage of that inflation due to elites' connections to government? The fraud, subsidies, grants, foreign aid, wars, and wasteful spending like $100 rolls of toilet paper?
A rough estimate from mainstream and libertarian views pegs 40 to 60% to these factors. This includes cronyism enabling deficit spending that pressures money creation, with fraud alone costing $233 to $521 billion annually today.
What would the men of the 1913 generation say about this modern inflation outcome?
Shaped by the gold standard's near zero inflation, they would condemn it as a moral and economic catastrophe. Critics like Lindbergh would call it invisible theft from savers to debtors, proving the Fed was a scheme to impoverish the masses. Even supporters might lament the loss of original restraints.
What would those men have done to avoid such high inflation?
They might have rejected the Federal Reserve Act entirely. Instead, they would advocate maintaining a strict gold standard, limiting federal banking powers, and enforcing balanced budgets to prevent monetary expansion tied to deficits.
What happened to the gold standard after the Federal Reserve's creation, and when was it fully abandoned?
The U.S. maintained a form of the gold standard initially after 1913. It was fully abandoned in 1971 under President Nixon,
Severing the dollar's convertibility to gold and allowing unrestricted money printing, which accelerated inflation. How do wages and everyday goods compare in gold terms rather than dollars since 1913?
In gold terms, average hourly wages have risen dramatically, buying far more gold today and showing real economic growth. Everyday goods like bread have remained relatively stable in gold prices.
However, in dollar terms, inflation has caused prices to skyrocket, masking this progress and eroding savings. Who benefits most from ongoing inflation under the current system? Debtors, including the government, benefit as inflation reduces the real value of their debts. Asset owners, such as those in stocks or real estate, see nominal gains from rising prices. Savers and fixed-income earners, like retirees, lose out as their money buys less over time. How has the Federal Reserve enabled massive government spending and wars without immediate tax hikes?
The Fed monetizes debt by buying government bonds with newly created money. This finances deficits for wars, entitlements, and stimulus programs.
It turns inflation into a stealth form of financing, avoiding direct tax increases on current voters. What might the U.S. economy look like today without the Federal Reserve and on a strict gold standard? It would likely feature near zero average inflation with periods of deflation and more stable prices.
There might be fewer boom-bust cycles, a smaller government, and lower national debt.
However, it would offer less flexibility for rapid stimulus during economic crises. Did the Federal Reserve prevent or worsen economic crises like the Great Depression?
Critics argue the Fed worsened the Great Depression by failing to provide adequate liquidity and defending the gold standard too rigidly.
Without the Fed, a pure gold system might have led to sharper but shorter panics.
Overall, it prolonged the suffering through poor policy decisions.
Why do some advocate returning to a gold standard today?
Advocates want to restrain unchecked money printing and prevent excessive inflation. This could protect savers from currency devaluation.
It would limit government overreach, endless deficits, and wars by promoting fiscal discipline. So it would constrain modern monetary interventions during downturns. What are the potential implications of this type of financial abuse through inflation and debt policies?
It widens inequality by transferring wealth from average citizens to elites via cronyism and subsidies. Economic instability arises from boom-bust cycles fueled by easy money. Trust in institutions erodes, potentially leading to social unrest or populist movements.
What warnings should we heed about these practices?
Such policies normalize unsustainable spending,
Risking hyperinflation like in historical fiat failures such as Weimar Germany. Fraud and waste like bloated contracts compound the issues by diverting resources from productive uses.
They create moral hazards, encouraging endless wars and aid without accountability, which could lead to currency collapse if deficits spiral.
Finally, explain how this debt is essentially paid off by the labor of future generations.
National debt acts as deferred taxation or inflation repaid through future generations' economic output, activity, and taxes. Interest payments consume budget shares that could fund their services or infrastructure. Inflation diminishes their real wages and savings, forcing them to work harder for devalued dollars. If growth stalls, they face higher explicit taxes or austerity to service the accumulated debt from prior wasteful spending, wars, and subsidies.